verse 4, it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for he is God's" what? "Minister or servant to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister." A what? An avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. All right. So I want to think about this verse in keeping with that phrase. He does not bear the sword in vain. The only reasonable identification of this phrase is capital punishment. That is the only punishment administered by the government that involves a sword. Now, we did make a note last week that it entails every type of punishment that the government might inflict on those who are evildoers. But the phraseology essentially says the government can do whatever it decides to do with evildoers, and do so with God, essentially with God's blessing. Because it says he is God's servant to execute wrath on those who do evil. And so the concept of what is under consideration here is it's undeniable. In other words, there's no question as to the fact that Paul has said that God has granted to civil government the power to practice capital punishment. And then in the notes, as previously noted, in Genesis 9 and verse 6, capital punishment was enjoined all the way back in the days of Noah. Whosoever sheds man's blood, that's a reference to murder, by man shall his blood be shed. In other words, God says this matter is to be taken into your hands. You take care of this. And in Genesis 6 and verse 9 it says, "By man shall his blood be shed, because he is made in the image of God." And so capital punishment was enjoined from the earth. Now, when I say the earliest days, obviously Noah lived 1,650 years after creation. But we do have reference to capital punishment as a matter of vengeance all the way back to the days of Lamech. Lamech was the first polygamist in Genesis chapter 5. But he said, "I have wounded a young man for my hurting." In other words, someone had attacked him or done something to him to harm him, and Lamech killed him in response to that action. And the statement is made in the Bible, if Cain shall be avenged, sevenfold or whatever, I'll be avenged 70-fold. And now, I'm not saying that that's the right attitude to have, but the point of the matter is that capital punishment was enjoined from the earliest days of man's existence, because man is made in the image of God. It's accountability. Because no other creature is made in man's image, none. And so man is a special creation of God.
Animals don't know right and wrong. We do.
That's right. Animals are not immoral. Animals are amoral, which means they are neither moral nor immoral. There is no standard of morality with regard to the animal kingdom. But men are not like that. Men understand the concept of morality, of right and wrong, and so.
Probably men more in line to be a deterrent, not somebody does something wrong, kill them.
Right, and we talked about that a little bit last week with reference to the speedy execution of discipline on the part of the evildoer, because punishment is not executed speedily. against the evildoers. The hearts of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse number 1. And then the passage we mentioned last week from Deuteronomy 21, 18 to 21, and other passages talk about the exercising of capital punishment is given as a deterrent. All of Israel will see and fear. And again, Ecclesiastes 8 says, when punishment is administered quickly, it serves as a deterrent. And when the punishment is not administered quickly, it serves as an enticement, as an enticement to those that might do wrong. All right, now the top of page 3. I said, it is interesting, at least to me, that even Cain understood the gravity of his sin against Abel and against God when he said, my punishment is greater than I can bear. In other words, he understood what he did was punishable by death. In other words, I can't bear the punishment that I deserve. And then, of course, I heard a guy say the other day, he said, talking about how humanity hasn't changed. He said at one time one man killed 25% of the whole human race. 25% of the entire human race was a murderer. But the point is, Abel was made in the image of God, and Cain killed him. And Cain understood that his punishment was greater than he himself would be able to bear. Let me just add this. Most people do not understand properly the mark of Cain. The Bible says that God placed a mark on Cain. But the mark on Cain was not to punish Cain, it was to protect Cain. If you go back and if we'll go back and read the text, it says God put a mark on him to make sure that nobody exacted the punishment that he deserved. He's like, I'm a vagabond in the earth. Essentially, everybody that is ever going to live in my lifetime is going to know exactly what I did, right? I mean, when you start with 4 and you kill one of them, and there's only one woman left on the planet, every single person on the planet that's going to live in your lifetime is going to know exactly what he did. God placed the mark on Cain as a protective measure, lest anyone would kill Cain. In other words, the mark was given that God said, don't kill this man. In other words, the mark of Cain was a positive for Cain and not a negative. All right. Also, top of page 3, the second paragraph. In the law of Moses, which was given in part to establish a theocracy. And let me just make a note here. This is one of those things where most people, especially infidels, don't understand how the Old Testament worked. When they cite all of the rules of the Old Testament as an injunction against believing in the Bible, what they don't understand is that the law of Moses was both a political and a religious law. In other words, there were prescriptions for worship and living, and then there were also prescriptions for crime. In other words, the entirety of the law of Moses was given to rule the people in every aspect of their lives. Both politically or socially and religiously. And that is not the case for the New Testament. The New Testament is not given as a political document. It's not given to govern over the governments of men. It's given to govern the hearts of men. And so there's a vast difference between the prescriptions that we find in the Old Testament and what we find in the New Testament. And many so-called Bible believers don't understand these differences, but certainly no infidel understands the difference. And so it's not proper. It's not proper to use the Old Testament as a cudgel against people who believe the Bible, because that law was given both as a religious and a political / social law. All right, but the law of Moses, which was given in the establishment of a theocracy, the death penalty was commanded for a multitude of transgressions, including murder, striking your mother or father, punishable by death, Exodus 21:15-17. Kidnapping, punishable by death, Exodus 21:16. Failure to properly sacrifice. In other words, if you messed up the worship, you could be punished by death, Leviticus 17:3-4. Eating blood, punishable by death, Leviticus 17:10. Every form of sexual sin, punishable by death, Leviticus 18:6-29. And by the way, I didn't even begin to exhaust that list. I mean, if you had an ox that gored somebody to death, and it could be proven that ox had already been out of control in time past, the owner of the ox was to be put to death. Or if you had an ox and you knew that ox had a bad attitude, and you let that ox kill somebody, you were punished by death under the law of Moses. I mean, there is the list of things punishable by death. Listen, a man picked up sticks on the Sabbath day. Went out and picked up sticks on the Sabbath day. And they didn't know what to do with him. Moses said, put him in jail. The word there is ward, W-A-R-D. Put him in ward and I'll go ask the Lord about this. Goes and asks the Lord. The Lord says, bring him out and stone him to death. I mean, listen, God meant business. He wanted his people to obey him. He wanted his people to be an obedient, pure people. Nadab and Abihu offered a sacrifice that was unauthorized in Leviticus chapter 10, 1 and 2. And God took that matter into his own hands and he killed them. And he killed the sons of Korah in Numbers 14. I mean, there's probably 20 or 30 transgressions under the law of Moses punishable by death. 20 or 30. And that's a conservative number. Ma'am?
There's something wrong with their life.
Something wrong with my life. How about now? I should be up now. All right, third paragraph. Third paragraph. While one may oppose capital punishment on a number of grounds, and there are any number of reasonable reasons to oppose capital punishment. For example, if it was not being administered fairly, that would be a reasonable cause. Or if it wasn't done equitably, that would be a reasonable reason to oppose it. But the Bible cannot be used to oppose it. I had a discussion with a guy, and this doesn't have anything to do exactly with capital punishment, but it deals in the realm of crime and punishment. I was talking with Dr. Cash and the vet one time about an incident where a guy had committed a crime and he killed somebody, and he got whatever it was he got was quite a bit more than people who did the same thing got. And he was arguing that his punishment was too harsh. And my argument was, no, his punishment wasn't harsh enough, and all the rest of these guys didn't get punished harsh enough. You kill somebody drunk driving, and you get 6 months in prison or whatever. In my mind, that ain't right. And so my take would be, if it's not being distributed or practiced equitably, then you need to punish more people to even it out. And then it becomes a deterrent. One of the common arguments that people try to use with reference to arguing against capital punishments from the Ten Commandments, which says, "Thou shalt not kill." But the word there for kill in the Old Testament is the word for murder. And there are different words. For example, the Old Testament had a word for manslaughter. Manslaughter is not murder. The result is the same, but the intention is not the same. And then, the statement about killing a sacrifice at evening is not the same word. The word is not you will murder your sacrifice at evening. So there's the concept of killing, which means to simply like to kill an animal. There's the concept of manslaughter, which is the unintentional killing of a human being. And then there's thou shalt not kill, which is the word for murder, which is to take an innocent, which is to take deliberately, intentionally take an innocent life. Even the Apostle Paul affirmed the right of the Roman government to execute him. He said in Acts 25 and verse 11, "For if I am an offender or have done anything worthy or deserving of death, I do not object to dying." That's, in other words, Paul said, if you can prove the case against me, I'll submit myself to it. Which, by the way, Paul ended up being executed, as a wrongdoer, but not because he was actually a wrongdoer. But Paul affirmed the right of the government to practice this. Peter affirmed the same principles in 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17, wherein we are commanded to be subject to the ruling authorities, specifically even here kings or governors, as those who are ordained to administer punishment on evildoers. Going back to Genesis 4 and Genesis 9, I believe in capital punishment, not because I do not recognize the inherent value in every human being, but because I do. Capital punishment reaffirms the value of a human life. It does not diminish the value of human life. All right, number 5, which comes from, what verse is this? 6 and 7. "For because of this, which is the government punishing evildoers, because of this you also pay taxes. For they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes, custom to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." This idea is common throughout the New Testament, and we'll look here in this first note. In response to the insincere question as to whether or not Jews should pay taxes to Caesar. Now you remember this in Matthew 22, right? They came to him, tempting him, saying, "Is it lawful to pay tribute or taxes to Caesar or not?" Now they were saying this to tempt him or trap him, because they wanted him to say no. Now, one reason they wanted him to say no because they didn't want to pay taxes, but they also wanted him to say no so that they could snitch on him and have him offed by the Roman government. He said, "Bring me a piece of money." They brought him a coin. He said, "Whose inscription is on the money?" They said, "Caesar's." He said, "Then render to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and to God the things that belong to God." Now this is an important concept because Jesus affirmed the right of the Roman government to tax God's people. Right? He affirmed the right of the Roman government to tax God's people. Now, one of the interesting things about this statement is that about 5 minutes later, as they were accusing Jesus before Pilate, they said, "He forbids people to pay taxes to Caesar." Like, you weren't listening very well, were you? Of course, look, when people want what they want, they'll say whatever they can say to get what they want. And look, they just bald-faced lied on Jesus. Oh, it was. He never said that. He said you do pay taxes. He affirmed the responsibility of the Jews to pay their own temple tax. Remember when the Pharisees asked Peter, "Does your master not pay the temple tax?" And before Peter could even answer talk to the Lord about it. He goes, well, of course he does. And then so Peter goes running back to the Lord, and the Lord intercepts him and says, hey, Peter, let me ask you a question about paying taxes. Who do the kings take taxes from? The sons or the servants? He said, well, the servants. He said, well, then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go cast a hook in the water, and the first fish you catch, you're going to have a coin in his mouth. Go pay your taxes and mine. And so the Bible repeatedly affirms the right of the governing authorities to tax the people. Now, all right. Now this is my op-ed in the next paragraph. All right. This is my op-ed. I don't think any right-thinking person thinks we should pay more taxes. I don't believe any right-thinking person thinks that we ought to pay more taxes. Most of us believe we pay too much in taxes, especially considering what we receive in return. But in light of Paul's statement here and Peter's statement in 1 Peter 2, it is not even accurate to refer to taxes as a necessary evil. You see where I'm going with this? When we talk about taxes as a necessary evil, but the truth of the matter is they're just plain necessary. Now, they can be excessive, they can be wasteful, but they're necessary. I mean, if you don't pay taxes, you don't have policemen. If you don't pay taxes, you don't have firemen. If you don't pay taxes, you don't have paved roads or even gravel roads as far as that goes. You don't have a military if you don't pay. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't think about in the overall scheme, of paying taxes. But without them, nobody wants to live in a land without governing authorities. Nobody wants anarchy, and that's what you have without governing authorities. Anytime we complain about living in the greatest nation on earth, we would do well to remember or learn the words of Winston Churchill, who said, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all the other forms that have been tried from time to time." Ours is the worst, except for all the others. And there's a lot to be, we have a lot to be thankful for when we compare our situation to the situation in which every single person in the New Testament lived. Nobody in the New Testament lived under a situation as good as ours. Nobody. Every year when I go in, I pay my taxes at the assessor's office. I say it every year. I say, "Here comes Marion County's happiest taxpayer." They know I'm going to say that every year, and they just laugh. And one man was standing there, and he said, "I don't get it." I said, "Because if I have to come in here and pay taxes, it means that the Lord's blessed me to own something." And he said, "I never thought about it that way." There's even a blessing involved. Besides all the other things that we receive, there's still a blessing involved. Like, for example, now don't get me wrong, they want to find a replacement for property taxes, I'm all for it. But at the same time, I also realize that paying those things means I got something. There's billions of people living on this planet that don't own anything, right? I mean, they don't own anything, and so there's a proper way to look at these things and try to correct, perhaps try to correct some things, make them more equitable or efficient, whatever. But you can't just say we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. All right. Any thoughts on that before I go to question 6? All right, which is from verse 8. By the way, this is an entire swerve in theme and subject matter. Now, there's the sense in which "oh no man anything" can somewhat be tied to paying your taxes, but in verse 8, which is question 6, and that's verses 8 and 9. owe no man anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, all are what? Summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, let's go to the top of page 4. What? Should have got your handsy daughter to get you page 4 and 5. You would think so. Anybody else need a 4 and 5? Now, I gave you 4 and 5 last week, young lady. I did. No? You can just add it to your collection. Four and 5. All right, this section goes all the way back to the theme of this subsection goes back to the theme of the entire section, which is, let love be without hypocrisy. Chapter 12, verse 9, which sets a banner, an overarching banner, for essentially everything that just about follows all the way through chapter 15, verse 13. In other words, essentially everything can be tied under that banner, let love, or in my opinion, it should say, love is without hypocrisy. And then here's the ways that love is manifest. Okay? Now, before we leave the former context in its entirety, note the contrast between verses 1 and 7 and verse 8 and following. In verse 1 through 7, Paul speaks of those things in which we are inherently obligated. Thus the repeated imperatives beginning in verse 5. You must be subject. You must pay taxes. Render to all their due. Do you see the imperative nature of these things? They're statements of command. Now there's a shift in verse 8 when it's talking about love. Now, are we commanded to love? We are. There's a lot of John 13. We're commanded to love. But looking at verse 8, we are given a divine obligation to love all men. While it is our obligation to do so, it is not necessarily due to any debt incurred to do so. In other words, we pay taxes because there's a debt involved. Provision of firemen and policemen and military and roads and all the things that we have that are necessities for a civil society. In other words, there's a debt involved in paying these taxes, but we don't love somebody else with regard to debt to that person, but we do love them in regard to our debt to God. And see, there's a difference there. All right? So it is our obligation to do so, not due to any debt incurred to do so. While I love my mother, there is a personal debt I owe her that can never be repaid. Is that right? You never can repay your mother, right? But I'm also commanded to love my enemies, right? And and loving my enemies is vastly different in its origins and obligations than loving my mother. But I'm still commanded to love my enemies, not because I'm indebted to them, but it's my obligation from God to love them. So I love my enemies, Matthew 5:43-48, regardless of what I may think they are owed. You know, kind of like Opie. You know, what'd you give your friend? A sock in the head? You know, and I forgot exactly what Andy said about that, but Opie's answer was, "Oh, I enjoyed it." We love our enemies despite what we think we owe them. You know, to love is the ultimate test of discipleship. To love is the ultimate test of discipleship. Finally, in reference to the opening line in verse 8, "Owe no man anything," this text does not forbid borrowing money. I've heard people try to use this text as a text against borrowing money. That's not even remotely what's under consideration here. And even that phrase itself doesn't lend itself to a situation of a mutual agreement to borrow money. You know, my house is not paid for. I owe money on it, right? But I don't speak about owing Pennymac. You know, as long as my monthly mortgage is paid, I don't owe them in that sense. That's what's under consideration here. You know, now, if I stop making my mortgage payment, then I'm indebted. So this is not the concept under consideration. The NIV gives a better sense of the meaning where it renders the text. By the way, the NIV is not a word-for-word translation. Okay, and the NIV underwent a major revision in 2010, I believe it was, and it's a whole lot better now than it used to be when it came out in 1973. All right. The NIV is what is called a dynamic equivalent. In other words, it doesn't strive to render the original text word for word. It tries to give the meaning of the text in the eyes of the translation committee. Okay, so I want you to understand that when I'm giving you this statement. This is not a word for word rendering of this text, but it does give a good sense of what the text is trying to say. It says, "Let no debt remain outstanding." Let no debt remain outstanding. Borrowing money or items is found throughout both testaments without condemnation. In was it 2 Kings 6? The borrowed axe head, Elisha and the floating axe head. The axe head fell in the water. And the young prophet came up to Elisha and said, "Master, the axe head has fallen into the water." He said, "And alas, it was borrowed." And that was a major expenditure. Of course, Elijah made that iron axe head float, and he got it back. But the principle was, it was borrowed. In other words, borrowing is not anti-biblical. Okay. In the parable of the talents, what was the one talent man condemned for? He was condemned, number one, for being lazy, and was condemned for being so lazy that he didn't even give that talent to the bankers so that he could get interest on it. And why does the bank take in money? It takes in money to loan money. It pays you this amount of interest on your money so that they can loan it to somebody else for a higher amount of interest. But the point is that even if borrowing money was a sin, then Jesus would not have used that as, look, at the very minimum you should have done this. Okay, so the Bible does not forbid the idea of borrowing, particularly borrowing money. But the writer of Proverbs did say, as Dave Ramsey probably quotes about every day on his show, the borrower is the slave of the lender. The borrower is the slave of the lender. And so that's just simply a warning about borrowing too much. overextending oneself. All right, we're going to stop right there. What is today? The 12th, so it'll be the 19th. That'll be verse number 10.